this is going to be a quick whirlwind run through some other aspects of economics that seem to be kind of important and relevant. Increasingly, I think the whole purpose of studying anything is just that you have an understanding of maybe what's going on in the world, what's around you, what's happening. So this is an attempt to give some insight into some of the things that you might see, you might experience in terms of discussions about reforming healthcare systems, about how to interact with those systems and so on and so forth. And it comes from bits of economics that were developed in other guises and towards other applications. So the bits of economics that are primarily being focused upon organisations. So whereas Victoria's been talking about the economics that explains how people behave, like when you change prices they do things differently, or when you change the circumstances. This is the economics that has grown up around trying to understand what organisations do and what might influence what organisations do and why that's important and what we can do about it. So that's what this is about. So title's a bit dry, markets and contracts. What are we going to be talking about? Why are we going to be focusing on those things? Well, I'm going to switch attention away from people's health in the first instance to talking about the delivery of things that are supposed to improve their health. Healthcare. So this is about healthcare and healthcare systems. And producing anything in the economic system requires a fantastic degree of coordination. When I was first taught economics, this was I had a really great teacher first off, and so he came into the room and you thought you knew what economics was about. So economics is about this tin of tuna, and slapped it down on the table. Everybody thinks the man's mad, but never mind. So I bought this tin of tuna this morning. I went to the shop, so I thought I wanted a tin of tuna, and I bought it. So you think about what has gone into the production of that tin of tuna, the huge set of coordinated decisions that were necessary in order to produce that. And I never told anybody I wanted a tin of tuna this morning, but I went into the shop and it's there. We get so used to the idea that our kind of system, our economic system, delivers up the things that we need and want as and when we want them. We kind of forget that that's a pretty remarkable thing that's going on. And in particular, we get to know more about it and we get to focus more on it when it goes wrong, which it's more likely to do in the context of healthcare delivery for reasons I'll explain. So producing anything at all requires this huge degree of coordination. And generally speaking, out there in the rest of the world, when it comes to tins of tuna, for example, we rely upon these things called firms to do that for us. There's a production process, there's a supermarket that buys the tuna in, there are firms that can tuna, there are whole sort of realms of organisations that are necessary to engage in that productive process. And to put it simply, we rather think that how those organisations make their decisions, what they end up doing, depends upon a whole load of things. And things I would emphasise is that in the typical sort of explanation of how markets work, we emphasise a lot about how those firms interact with their customers, how they perceive their consumers and what they can earn from those consumers, how they interact with each other. Now, that's very obvious in the case of when you talk about Tesco versus the supplier of tins of tuna, but it also matters when you talk about Tesco versus Sainsbury's. We argue that the more firms there are, the lower the prices they'll be prepared to sell their goods for. So how they interact with each other, and all of those things sort of in turn depend on the nature of these structures that we call markets, and how customers deal with organisations, which again sort of interacts with the nature of the market. Now that's all very kind of general. That's thinking about production in the economy generally, and when we in economics study this, textbook after textbook gives you this kind of mantra. If we have markets where there are lots of competing suppliers, if the consumers are well informed, then everything works nicely. Tins of tuna appear on the supermarket shelves, And when we look at the price of the tin of tuna, we think it's pretty fair, it's pretty close to what it costs to produce. So that's what we say happens in the context of just general production in the textbook case. And then we have healthcare. And it doesn't matter whether you look in developed settings or lower middle income setting, healthcare somehow seems kind of different. But you know, those preconditions for these markets to work how we want them to don't appear to be there. We've got consumers, who we now call patients or sick people, who are not very well informed about what is required in terms of the product they buy. We often have very limited, and that's particularly true in global health and lower middle income settings, very limited choice as to where to get those services that they need, that healthcare. And then we have something else which has fascinated economists. We have a sort of insertion between the consumer and the producer of various organisations, which I've called here third-party payers. Okay, well, think insurance and think governments. In other words, the fact that many healthcare systems are organised in such a way that the consumers don't actually face the prices of the care that they receive, that somebody else is picking up the bill, some other organisation is picking up the bill, whether it's the government or whether it's the Ministry of Health or whether it's a private insurance company. And those things all acting together have pretty, sort of severe implications for the way in which you think about markets working in this particular context. And so, that really has focused a lot of attention on thinking, where will things go wrong, why might they go wrong, and what can you do about it? I'm going to mostly focus in the first part about that on this issue of third-party purchasing. Because I think, this is just a personal flash, I think this is really important. The idea that, as distinct from other kinds of economic production, we have often separated out the role of financing from the actual role of consuming. So patients, sick people, receive the services, but some other organisation is paying for those services. And the way in which payment is made turns out to be very important. In particular, one of the things that is important there is that, as distinct from individual consumers, those organisations that are actually doing the paying for healthcare, be they the government or be they insurance companies, are actually pretty powerful in the sense that they are often, if not the only, the main purchaser of things. And so rather than the sort of standard market model where, as consumers, we're sort of kind of powerless, I don't actually go in and negotiate with Tesco's about the price of a tin of tuna. When you're the government buying healthcare, you have that option. And what's more, you have the option of saying, not that I'm going to buy this tin of tuna now, but I'm going to buy tins of tuna for the next 5 years. I want you to do me a deal on those tins of tuna. Or you have the option of specifying various other side conditions that might be attached. And that in particular, when you come to sort of healthcare, says that this notion that markets are generally organised by the provider naming a price and the customer paying the price, that doesn't apply. And it's given rise to a huge degree of interest in how it might be appropriate to do that deal, to do that transaction. When you're a big powerful third party purchaser, when you are the Ministry of Health, what should you be doing to your what deals should you be striking with your healthcare organisations that are operating in your country? To give a very, very oversimplified sort of portfolio of choices, what do we actually observe? One kind of arrangement that's really quite common is just fixing a budget or paying over an amount and letting the healthcare organisation get on with things. Imagine that in the world of general goods and services. Here you are, Tesco. Here's 500 quid. Give me some food over the year. That's the kind of deal that's a fixed budget. The alternatives which have become increasingly in focus are things which tend to tie that remuneration of the healthcare provider to the activity that they undertake. And the ones that are most associated with that sort of activity-based payment come into two categories. One, not so prevalent in low middle income country settings, but was really very much the sort of dominant model under private insurance in healthcare in developed countries, is this sort of fee-for-service arrangement, in which, you know, in the what would often have been called the bad old days, the insurance company would simply send in a bill on account of the patient that would specify each and every treatment that they've received, and then expect that bill to be settled. That came to be replaced under private insurance, largely, but not completely, it's still there, it still exists for a lot of dental services and lots of other areas of healthcare, but it came to be replaced increasingly by large purchasers of healthcare, big insurance companies or the government, by arrangements that said, no, actually what we're going to do is we're going to pay you for treating the patient, and you tell us, or we'll agree what conditions the patient had, and we will pay a fixed price for that. And that's activity based upon the number of patients that are treated within a given category. So that's a different kind of mechanism. And then, just to complete the picture, what you increasingly see, like, you know, popping up everywhere, is this reference to performance-based payment, where, okay, so we've gone from just saying to the equivalent of Tesco, here's a load of money, to I'm going to pay you for each tin of tuna you provide me, you know, £1 over the year, to saying I'm going to pay you for each tin of tuna you provide me, but I'm going to actually taste the tuna, and if I don't like the taste of it, I'm going to reduce your payment. If I think it's really excellent tuna, I'm going to pay you more. I'm going to give you some kind of performance bonus, or whether I'm going to decide that the tuna has to have been delivered within 10 minutes of 10 o'clock on Monday morning, and if you don't manage that, then I won't pay you, or I'll pay you less. That's pay for performance type things. And so what we see out there in the world of healthcare is a lot of discussion, debate, and you know, policy action around how we should pay for healthcare delivery. And that turns out that the evidence is increasing that how things are purchased in this world of healthcare, where we haven't got where we haven't got well-informed consumers, and where we've got a lot of third party, and that really matters. Fixed budgets, although very, very popular and still dominate the sort of world, particularly as regards sort of government provision of health services. You know, the way in which you organise a hospital sector is give the hospital an annual budget. Fixed budgets, we now know, are not very good in terms of expanding activity. In fact, they tend to do the opposite. They don't, as it turns out, give very good incentives to control costs. We know this from everyday existence. You know, if you ever work within an organisation where you have a budget, what happens when it gets near to year end? People spend their budgets. They do so, however, you know, not necessarily in the most effective way. And the sort of economics of this tells you that what you're going to get here very much depends upon the intrinsic motivation of those providing organisations. In other words, if you have providers that are not very highly motivated, are not well aligned with your interests in delivering healthcare, you're not going to get very much out of this kind of system. When we talk about treatment-based, that's the old fee-for-service type story, which, you know, we put in here almost as a sort of legacy. Well, we learnt a lot from the experience of fee-for-service systems. They often give rise to a huge amount of actual treatments. They whack up activity. But the problem there is that often the activity is not the kind of activity we really want to see. You know, these might be spurious kinds of treatments. It used to be the case in the sort of US system where you had a lot of insurance that paid fee-for-service. You know, you could barely go in with a sore finger without having a full MRI scan. You know, that's true. You know, they would give you all sorts of kinds of treatment. So that's certainly the case. And the consequence of that was the cost of treating people under those kinds of systems can be enormously high. So that shows you it really does matter. You've got a very fixed, limited budget, and you choose to pay providers of healthcare according to each and every injection they give or each and every scan they give. You're going to exhaust that budget on a very few people quite quickly. And against that background, he says, I'm beginning to sound like I'm standing on a soapbox, you know, this is a Hyde Park corner now, I'm making my speech. Against that background, we have systems that have moved towards paying based upon the patient, and actually those have a reasonably good sort of track record. We know that now. They tend to be rather good for controlling costs. Ooh, go away. They tend to be rather good for controlling costs. That's manifested itself incidentally in a whole host of evidence that as systems in the high-income countries have moved towards patient-based payment, we have observed reductions in hospital lengths of stay and expenditures. So this has mostly worked in hospital-based systems, and in hospital-based payment, when you move to those fixed prices per patient treated, you observe much greater throughput of the system and at a lower unit cost. So we know that's true. And associated with that, however, has been a lot of concern about the fact that, well, that might all be being achieved by skimping on the quality of treatment that people want to know. In other words, have we provided incentives for hospitals to treat people quickly but badly? And although that's a definite possibility, we haven't actually seen an awful lot of that. So it kind of suggests that, you know, there is an awful lot in favour of moving towards that kind of system, and certainly good reasons to move away from that. And if you haven't got one already, don't go towards that. Seems to be the line. But that's why I was going to show this slide. So you can't see the numbers, so I'll just talk you through it. There's my little dog. Oh, very cute. Starts hopping. Now we're in the dreadful world of veterinary healthcare. It's fee for service, folks. You go along to this specialist weir referrals, which is a bit like the guy, the super vet, if you see him on TV, only it's the sort of poor man's version of that, although, as it turns out, not very poor man's version. And you go along, you say, my dog's hopping, and they pull on the leg and say, yeah, we can treat that, it's got a dodgy knee or something like that, oh, book it in with us. And then they produce you one of these things when you go to collect the dog up, and you can't see it here, but there's thousands of lines here, and it's each little dose of painkiller, and each little bandage, and then time of the anaesthetist and time of the sort of surgeon. There's a figure at the end, I can't remember what it is now, I probably want to forget it. It was like £2,700. Okay, so that's fee for service for you. And that shows you how, you know, payment systems really matter. And of course, if I'd have been a more empowered consumer, I'd have said, look, I'm not going to pay on this basis. Let's agree a price up front and let's do it. So we've got, I think we can say, you know, from this sort of whirlwind tour, that we've got pretty good knowledge now about the pros and cons of different means of purchasing healthcare. And those have largely been developed in the sort of high income settings, but I think many of them do sort of translate across. And one is that fixed budgets are pretty weak, but generally the activity or patient-based sort of payment systems are pretty strong in terms of incentives. They can be tuned as well to encourage the right kinds of activity. I mean, economists love the idea of the power of prices. Of course, in these systems you set prices, and so you can push prices up to indicate, just as you know, Victoria was saying, you know, the prices work on the consumers to signal to them, you know, this is worth doing it cheap, I can do it. So you can signal to producers, this is expensive, it's worth doing through those systems. I left then out of it, you know, P for P. What about pay for performance? Actually, economists think they know quite a lot about that as well. And what they know about that is that it should be treated pretty much with a degree of caution. Why? You know, why isn't it good to just pay for what you want? Why wouldn't I sign the contract with Tesco's to say if you don't deliver it within 10 minutes of 10 o'clock, you don't get paid? You know, I want it at 10 o'clock in the morning, why don't I do that? The problem turns out to be there are many aspects of what you want that you don't actually specify. And there's the rub. If you tie down performance in certain things which you can observe, then the performance in the things you can't observe might be hopelessly compromised. So I might be able to tell when Tesco's delivers my tuna, but actually, although I mentioned it, quality is never something I can verify afterwards. Okay? I can never actually confirm whether it was good tuna or bad. And so I can't actually condition payment on that. But I can make it, you have to deliver it on time. The argument then goes, I'll always get my tuna on time, but it'll be rotten tuna, okay? Because everything will be focused upon delivering it at 10 o'clock, regardless. So there are all sorts of issues that economists have talked about. The words you hear mentioned are sort of gaming of the system, perverse incentives, unintended consequences that seem to follow from those kinds of systems. So we treat those with caution. And I wanted to say with this is a personal reflection. Against all of that, what do I see when I look around sort of most global healthcare systems? Somewhat sort of piecemeal and often kind of contradictory. There's still an awful lot of reliance upon fixed budgets. There are often also arbitrary other kinds of payments and transfers in these systems of picking up the bills for certain kinds of expenses or not others, paying for medicines, and paying for staff. You know? So these are kinds of sort of slightly perverse kinds of payment systems which just hand over sums of money, but largely about just transferring resources without focusing upon activity. So that seems odd. And then against that, what you see is, lots of particularly large organisations, donor organisations, and sort of oversight organisations rushing pell-mell towards instituting pay-for-performance type systems, often on a very small scale, piloting a particular scheme here or there, paying for this particular benefit or paying for this particular kinds of measure of performance. So as I see it, this is a landscape where we've got some good ideas about what we ought to be doing. The actual reality, not surprisingly, is far from the ideal, but where we see things changing over time and what we see changing over time seems to be mostly based upon small-scale initiatives rather than sort of system-level reforms. But I see that as kind of changing. So going back, it's about understanding the world around you. So when you see, within whatever country, these discussions of financing reforms, the adoption of different payment systems, the attempt to provide, the dreaded word incentives, and particularly when you see outside organisations rushing around trying to adopt some kind of different sort of payment system. This is the background against which all of that is set. This idea that it really matters, that you have power here when you're the purchaser of healthcare, and that what mechanism you choose to do the financing can make a difference in what happens. I'm going to talk at much less length about the second sort of aspect. I talk without apology at much less length because we don't know so much. Okay, this is an area where we are very much less well informed as to what might be the right things to do and what the best kinds of interventions are. Now we know markets are really important. Okay, we know that these interaction between firms in every other context makes a difference. We've got huge amounts of evidence of that. We've got huge amounts of evidence that when you change the number of firms that compete for things, you get different outcomes in terms of lower costs and lower prices. We know those things, but when it comes to healthcare and the very different circumstances in which firms operate within we don't even call them firms anymore, just generally organisational healthcare providers, that's a very different landscape. We have a mixture of motivations. Most of what we talk about in terms of markets and the rest of the economic system is generally predicated upon the fact that firms or organisations pursue profit. We don't even have that in healthcare. What do they pursue? We're not quite sure, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, it's useful to think of two things. There are two senses in which this relationship between firms can matter. One, in economics we call horizontal, and that's about how many firms there are delivering any one product or group of products. Of course, in about services and products. So that's the question of whether there is just Tesco's or there's Tesco's and Sainsbury's and Albury in the middle and all of that. And then there's this vertical relationship between firms, vertical markets. And that's the relationships that exist between Tesco and its suppliers, and those suppliers and the actual fundamental producers, you know. So we're talking of food products, you know, farmers to, you know, food packagers and sort of distribution companies down to Tesco. So that's what we call the vertical organisation of the industry. And I think one of the things that's becoming increasingly clear in sort of lower middle income country settings is that maybe that there needs to be a much more focus upon that production chain type idea. Sorry for the stupid things. The most important thing here is the idea that a production process is a sort of link set along a sort of chain of production. And you know, it's a cliche, but it's true, isn't it? You know, the chain's only as strong as its weakest link. You break down anywhere here, and the linkage is broken. And this seems to be really true of sort of complex supply chains in healthcare, where it's all very well and good talking about the incentives of the healthcare facilities, but if they can't get the medicines, and if the medicines don't get distributed to them, then there's nothing they can do. Or if they operate in a world in which it's just simply not possible to hire any more healthcare workers, they are severely constrained as to what's possible. So this idea that the healthcare production requires some sort of coordination across the supply chain is really important. And it's really complicated in healthcare. So there are many places for this chain to fall apart and break down. You know, we have to get the production of fundamental medicines and healthcare technology, whether it's drug companies or whatever, healthcare equipment manufacturers, we need to distribute those. They need to get down to the level of local healthcare providers before those things can actually deliver up healthcare. And then those things often operate across jurisdictions. We're talking about globalization and global production chains here. And they often involve very different kinds of organizations. Avaricious, profit-maximizing drug companies down to altruistic, not-for-profit healthcare facilities, for example. A couple of key points here which I think help understand this sort of landscape. I think when, particularly in the context of healthcare, when large organisations come to this, by which I mean, you know, the World Health Organization and funders and donors and so on, they tend to look at this from the sort of, from an economic point of view, from a sort of slightly dated planning kind of perspective, as though the resolution of these things is to somehow write down a grand plan and get everybody around the table and get things organised. And what we actually know from economics is that actually these things often work much better decentralised, surprisingly enough. So although there is a huge degree of importance to arranging coordination, it turns out that actually trying to get everybody in the same room isn't the way to do it most of the time. And actually, in other areas of economic activity, that coordination has tended to be very well managed, not by actually grabbing everybody together and trying to make them into a meta-organisation, but by organising the relationships between the different elements of the chain according to either market principles or contractual principles. So there is a lot there to be kind of learned. And I think we do know, actually, from all of this, that there are often advantages in separating out these production stages and just ensuring that those different players, those different organisations in the production process can come to arrangements with each other. So, whirlwind tour, what's the takeaway message from all of this? I mean, you know, lots and lots of economics is about, in global health, is about how we've got very limited resources and therefore it's really important to choose which treatments we deliver. That's clearly true. It's also about the fact that people's health is not about, you know, the medicines you give them, it's about how they choose to behave, and there are things we can do to influence that. That's very true. This is about, notwithstanding all of those things, even if we've decided what healthcare we want to deliver, and we've got the right, you know, mix there, how we actually organise its delivery matters greatly. And I think this is probably a slightly sort of forgotten or less than fully articulated message of economics in this particular domain. But it's one that's becoming increasingly important. So we are seeing, you know, albeit I would say it's piecemeal, the adoption of pay for performance. We are seeing increasing focus upon the supply chain and how to free up potential blockages in that supply chain, not by acting as some kind of omniscient director of operations, but by facilitating firms and producers within that chain come up with solutions for themselves. So how to spend and how to organise can be as important as how much we've got to spend and what we're going to spend it on. So that's